November 1968. The lecture hall at the University of Iowa City filled with students settling into wooden seats. At the podium stood a woman of 47 years, her blonde hair now touched with silver, her posture carrying the dignity of someone who had survived more than most could imagine. Margaret Weber Henderson adjusted her notes and placed a small object on the podium before her. A tiny brass compass, no bigger than a thumbnail, catching the afternoon light. She looked out at the young faces before her, at her daughter Sarah, sitting in the third row with notebook open and pen ready. 23 years, Margaret thought. 23 years since the choice that changed everything. She began to speak. This compass was given to me in a box of candy by an American sergeant who was simply sharing his afternoon snack. He had no idea that this simple gesture would change my entire understanding of the world. The students leaned forward, curious. 23 years ago, I was a prisoner of war at Camp Ellis, Illinois. I had served the Third Reich for 2 years, believing every word of propaganda that promised German superiority and American barbarism. What I discovered in 6 months of American captivity shattered those beliefs so completely that I chose to abandon my homeland and build a new life here. And it all began with a child's toy hidden in a box of Cracker Jack. She paused, letting the words settle. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to November 12, 1944, to a transport truck rattling through the frozen Illinois countryside, to 43 German women who thought they knew what awaited them in American captivity. We were wrong about everything. Part 1. The Abundance Illusion. The truck's metal bed was cold beneath them despite the blankets the Americans had provided. Margaret Weber pressed her thumb against the worn edge of her family photograph, the paper soft from constant handling. Her mother's face looked back at her, frozen in a moment of Dresden sunshine that felt like another lifetime. Her father stood beside her mother with his accountant's serious expression. Her 2 younger brothers wore their Wehrmacht uniforms with the pride of young men who believed they served righteousness. Margaret was 24 years old. She had volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1942, driven by patriotism rather than fanaticism. She had worked in administrative coordination in occupied France, managing supply records and personnel files. She had never fired a weapon, had never directly participated in combat operations, but she had believed with every fiber of her being that she served a just cause. The propaganda had been consistent and convincing. America was portrayed as a failing democracy torn apart by racial strife and economic collapse. American soldiers were depicted as undisciplined criminals, their military effectiveness a myth perpetuated by Jewish-controlled media. American abundance was described as a facade hiding desperate poverty and social disintegration. Margaret had absorbed it all, had believed it without question, had built her understanding of the world upon these foundations. Now those foundations were about to crumble. Beside her sat Clara Becker, the youngest of their group at 19. Her round face still held traces of adolescent softness despite months of rationed food. She had been crying quietly for most of the journey, homesick and frightened in equal measure. Margaret wanted to comfort her, but didn't know what words would help. She herself was terrified, though she hid it better. Across from them, Catherine Fisher studied the truck's interior with analytical precision. Kate was 23, a communications specialist with a sharp mind that never stopped observing, calculating, questioning. Even now, even as a prisoner, she was gathering data. "The truck is well maintained," Kate said quietly in German. "American military equipment is supposed to be inferior to ours, but this vehicle runs smoothly. No mechanical problems." Anna Richter, a former teacher from Berlin, in her early 30s, nodded slowly. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. "I have noticed the same. The guards' uniforms are clean and well-fitted. Their weapons are in excellent condition. Nothing suggests the desperation and scarcity we were told defines American military operations." The truck slowed, then turned. The grinding of gears changed pitch. Margaret finally allowed herself to look up to see what awaited them beyond the canvas covering. What she saw confused her more than frightened her. Camp Ellis looked almost disappointingly ordinary. Neat rows of wooden barracks stretched across well-maintained grounds. American soldiers moved about their duties with casual efficiency rather than menacing aggression. The perimeter fence was secure but not threatening. Everything was organized, professional, clean. Where was the chaos? Where was the evidence of American weakness and disorder? The truck stopped. An American officer approached a woman in her 30s with captain's insignia on her uniform. She gestured for the German women to disembark, speaking in heavily accented German about camp rules and procedures. I am Captain Sarah Mitchell. You will be housed in barracks 7 and 8. You will receive 3 meals daily. You will be assigned work details appropriate to your skills. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. The words sounded too good to be true, which made Margaret more suspicious rather than less. This had to be some kind of American trick, a psychological warfare tactic designed to lower their guard before the real cruelty began. She stepped down from the truck, her legs stiff from hours of travel. The November wind cut through her thin uniform, cold and sharp. Around her, the other 42 women were disembarking with varying degrees of trepidation. Some kept their eyes fixed on the ground. Others, like Kate, studied everything with careful attention. At the edge of the group stood Johanna Schmidt, a factory worker from Munich in her mid-30s. She was a widow, Margaret knew. Her husband had been killed on the Eastern Front 2 years earlier. Her 2 sons were still fighting somewhere in the chaos of Germany's crumbling empire. Johanna held herself with rigid military bearing, her jaw set in a hard line of determination. As they walked toward the barracks, Johanna leaned close to Margaret and whispered, "This is exactly what they told us. Americans lie with comfort before they strike with cruelty. Don't be fooled." Margaret nodded, wanting to believe Johanna's explanation, wanting the world to still make sense according to the rules she had learned. Inside Barrack 7, they found rows of metal frame beds, each with a thin mattress, 2 blankets and a pillow. At the foot of each bed sat a small wooden footlocker. It was Spartan, but far from the punishment cell conditions Margaret had been led to expect. Clara sat tentatively on one of the beds, testing the mattress with small bounces. "It's not what they told us it would be like," she whispered. Johanna's jaw tightened. "It's exactly what they told us. Americans lie with comfort. Don't let your guard down." But even as she spoke with conviction, Margaret noticed something. Johanna's fingers trembled slightly as she set down her small bag of possessions. The older woman was just as uncertain as the rest of them, just hiding it behind authority and warnings. The mess hall bell rang at 1800 hours, a sharp metallic sound that made several women flinch. They had been given 30 minutes to settle into their barracks before being summoned for their first meal. Margaret led a small group across the compound, maintaining the military bearing that had been drilled into her during training. She refused to show weakness or confusion in front of their captors. The mess hall was a long wooden building filled with rows of tables and benches. American soldiers occupied roughly half the space, eating and talking in relaxed clusters. The sight of men and women dining together so casually struck Margaret as improper, almost indecent. In Germany, military discipline maintained stricter separation. But what truly shocked her was what happened when they reached the serving line. An American private, a boy who looked barely 20 years old with red hair and freckles scattered across his pale face, began loading their metal trays with food. Mashed potatoes still steaming, the butter melting into golden pools on the surface, green beans glistening with moisture. 2 thick slices of roast beef, the meat grain visible pink in the center with a brown crust on the edges. A roll with butter, a cup of coffee, the aroma cutting through the smell of the food, and a small square of chocolate cake for dessert, the frosting glossy under the mess hall lights. Margaret stared at her tray in disbelief. This was more food than she had seen in a single meal in over 2 years. In Germany, rations had been steadily decreasing since 1942. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions. Butter was a distant memory. Chocolate was something children dreamed about, but never tasted. Yet here she stood, a prisoner of war, holding a tray laden with abundance that would feed her entire family back home for days. Elizabeth Hoffman, called Lisa by everyone, had worked as a nurse before the war. She leaned close as they found seats at an empty table. "This can't be real food," she whispered in German. "It must be drugged or poisoned. Why else would they feed prisoners better than their own civilians?" But the American soldiers were eating the same food from the same kitchen. Margaret watched them carefully, noting how they took the abundance for granted. Some even left food uneaten on their trays. The casual waste shocked her more than the quantity. These men were throwing away what would be precious in Germany. Kate sat across from Margaret with her tray untouched. "If this is standard prison food," she said quietly, "what do their civilians eat? What do their soldiers in combat receive?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications none of them wanted to acknowledge. If the propaganda had lied about American poverty and desperation, what else had been a lie? Margaret picked up her fork. Her hand trembled slightly. The first bite of roast beef melted in her mouth, rich and flavorful, in a way she had almost forgotten food could be. Around her, the other German women began to eat. Slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as hunger overcame suspicion. But with each bite, the foundation of everything they believed began to crack. Margaret Weber lay awake that first night in Camp Ellis, staring at the rough wooden ceiling of Barrack 7. Around her, 42 other German women slept or pretended to sleep, each processing in their own way what they had experienced during their first hours in American captivity. The meal haunted her. Not just the abundance of it, but the casual nature of that abundance. The American guards had shown no special attention to the food service, no pride in displaying their superiority. They had simply served standard prison rations, as if feeding captured enemies generously was the most normal thing in the world. Margaret had been raised in Dresden in a middle-class family. Her father worked as an accountant. Her mother managed their household with the efficient precision expected of German women. She had believed in the Reich not out of fanaticism, but out of patriotism, out of faith that her country's leaders knew what was necessary for Germany's survival and prosperity. When the Women's Auxiliary Corps had called for volunteers in 1942, Margaret had stepped forward without hesitation. She had been assigned to administrative coordination in occupied France, managing supply records and personnel files. She had believed she was serving a righteous cause, defending her homeland against enemies who wanted to destroy German culture and enslave German people. The propaganda had been consistent. America was failing. Americans were desperate. American soldiers were criminals hiding behind a facade of civilization. Yet the evidence of her own eyes contradicted every single claim. Margaret rolled onto her side, pulling the surprisingly clean blanket closer. 2 beds away, she could hear Clara crying softly in the darkness. The girl was homesick, frightened, too young to have developed the hardened shell that older prisoners cultivated. Tomorrow they would begin work assignments. Tomorrow they would interact more directly with their American captors. Tomorrow would bring more evidence that would either confirm her beliefs or continue to undermine them. Part of Margaret desperately wanted to cling to what she had been taught, to find explanations that preserved her worldview. Perhaps this camp was exceptional, designed specifically for propaganda purposes. Perhaps the food abundance was temporary, meant to soften them before interrogation. Perhaps everything would soon reveal itself to be the elaborate deception she had been warned about. But another part of her, a part she tried to suppress, whispered that perhaps she had been the one deceived all along. That perhaps the real propaganda had come from her own government, not from the enemy. That perhaps everything she had believed and served had been built on lies. The thought terrified her more than any physical threat the Americans could pose. The morning of November 13th dawned cold and gray over Camp Ellis. Margaret awoke to the sound of a bugle playing reveille, a military convention that felt oddly familiar despite the foreign setting. The German women dressed quickly in the same auxiliary uniforms they had worn since capture, their clothing wrinkled but reasonably clean. After another abundant breakfast that left them uncomfortable with fullness, Captain Mitchell announced work assignments. The women would be divided into groups based on their previous skills and training. Some would work in the camp laundry, others in the kitchen, still others in administrative offices or the medical facility. Margaret found herself assigned to the camp's central administration building along with Kate and Anna. They would be sorting and filing paperwork under the supervision of an American sergeant. The work itself was mundane and familiar, the kind of bureaucratic labor Margaret had performed throughout her service. But the working conditions were startling. The office was heated warm air flowing from radiators along the walls. Coffee was available throughout the day, a pot constantly brewing on a small table in the corner. The American staff treated them not as enemies, but as temporary workers, giving instructions without hostility and offering corrections without cruelty. Sergeant Robert Hayes was a middle-aged man from Ohio with graying hair and kind eyes. He spoke no German but used patient gestures and simple English words, repeating himself without frustration when they didn't immediately comprehend. His manner was professional but not cold. He seemed genuinely interested in making sure they understood their tasks. During their mid-morning break, he offered them coffee and cookies from a tin on his desk. The cookies were homemade oatmeal raisin, still carrying the faint scent of someone's kitchen. The tin had a handwritten label that read, "For Bobby, love Helen." He shared them as casually as he might share with American colleagues. Margaret took a cookie, the texture crumbly and sweet, in her mouth. She watched Sergeant Hayes as he sorted through paperwork, humming quietly to himself. He wore a wedding ring. The photograph on his desk showed two young women, probably his daughters. They looked to be roughly Margaret's age. This man had a family, had a life beyond the war, had a wife who baked him cookies and daughters he was proud of. He was not an abstract enemy. He was a person. And that realization was more dangerous than any weapon. Meanwhile, in the medical facility, Lisa was experiencing her own moment of cognitive dissonance. She had trained as a nurse before the war and had served in field hospitals in France. She expected American medical facilities to be crude and undersupplied based on propaganda claims about American industrial inadequacy. Instead, she found herself in a clean, well-equipped infirmary that rivaled or exceeded the German facilities she had worked in. The supplies were abundant. The equipment was modern. The procedures were professional. The American medical officer, Lieutenant Mary Chen, treated Lisa not as a prisoner, but as a fellow medical professional. She was Chinese-American. Margaret would learn later, a second-generation immigrant who had worked her way through medical school despite facing discrimination. She showed Lisa the supply rooms, explained their procedures, and even asked for Lisa's opinion on patient care protocols. The respect in her voice was genuine, not performative. In the camp laundry, young Clara worked alongside an American private named Daniel Miller, a farm boy from Iowa, who had been assigned to supervise the laundry detail. He noticed Clara struggling with the American washing machines, which were far more advanced than anything she had seen in Germany. Without condescension, he showed her how to operate them, his hands guiding hers through the process with professional courtesy. These small kindnesses accumulated throughout that first full day of work. Not dramatic gestures, not obvious attempts at manipulation, but simple human decency extended across enemy lines. By evening, when the German women gathered in their barracks, the conversations had begun to shift from suspicious analysis to confused acknowledgement. 3 weeks into their captivity, the German women had settled into an uneasy routine at Camp Ellis. The work was manageable, the food remained abundant, and the American staff continued their pattern of professional courtesy that contradicted everything the prisoners had been taught to expect. But they still maintained emotional distance, still waited for the other shoe to drop, still believed that American kindness must be hiding American cruelty. It was December 5th, 1944, during the afternoon break in the administration building, when everything changed. Sergeant Hayes had brought in a cardboard box from the camp commissary, setting it on his desk while he sorted through paperwork. Margaret watched from her filing station as he opened the box and pulled out smaller individual boxes, each bearing colorful printing and images. He called Kate over with a friendly gesture, holding out one of the small boxes to her. Kate approached cautiously, taking the offered item with uncertain hands. The box was red and yellow with the words "Cracker Jack" printed in bold letters above an image of a sailor boy and his dog. She turned it over, examining it with the careful attention of someone trained to analyze everything for hidden meaning. Sergeant Hayes pantomimed eating, then pointed at the box and smiled. "Candy and peanuts," he said slowly in English. "Caramel popcorn. Good." He handed boxes to Margaret and Anna as well, then distributed them to other prisoners working in nearby offices. Margaret opened her box carefully. The sweet smell of caramel hit her immediately, overwhelming after years of sugar rationing. Inside, she found candied popcorn and peanuts coated in a glossy brown glaze. She took a small piece, tentatively tasting it. The sweetness was almost painful in its intensity, her tongue unused to such concentrated flavor. Then Kate made a small sound of surprise. She had poured the contents into her hand and found something unexpected among the candied pieces. A small wrapped package containing a tiny toy. A miniature metal whistle painted red. "There's something inside," Kate said in German, her voice filled with confusion. "There's a toy inside the candy." Anna opened her box and found a small puzzle. Margaret discovered a tiny compass, brass and actually functional, the needle trembling as it sought magnetic north. Each box contained a different prize, a small treasure hidden among the sweets. The concept was incomprehensible. Why would anyone put toys inside food? What kind of society had such abundance that they could afford to give away prizes with candy? What kind of economy could sustain such frivolous generosity? Sergeant Hayes laughed at their expressions, clearly amused by their shock. "Prize inside," he explained, gesturing to show the surprise element. "Kids love it. Crackerjack always has a prize. The four German women stood in the administration office holding their Crackerjack boxes like sacred objects, staring at the tiny toys in their palms. In that moment, something fundamental shifted. This wasn't military rations or strategic generosity. This was ordinary American childhood. The baseline of civilian life that included toys hidden in candy boxes just for fun. If this was what American children took for granted, what did that mean about everything they had been told about American poverty and desperation? That evening in Barrack 7, the Crackerjack boxes became the center of intense discussion among the German women. Margaret sat on her bunk turning the tiny compass over in her fingers, while conversations swirled around her in urgent German whispers. Clara had heard about the incident from the women who worked in administration and had spread the story throughout both barracks. Now everyone wanted to see the evidence with their own eyes. The small toys were passed from hand to hand like religious relics, each woman examining them with expressions ranging from wonder to distress. "It's propaganda," one woman insisted, a former factory worker from Munich. "They're trying to convince us of American superiority with cheap tricks." But Anna shook her head, her teacher's mind working through the logical implications. "Propaganda would be showing us these things deliberately," she argued. "The sergeant shared them casually the way you'd share something ordinary and unremarkable. He didn't make a show of it. He didn't call attention to American abundance. He just handed out candy the way anyone might during a work break." Kate held up the tiny whistle she had found in her box. "These toys are manufactured," she said quietly. "Thousands of them must be produced to put one in every box. That requires industrial capacity, resources, design effort. All for something that children receive free with candy and probably throw away after a few days." The implications were staggering. Germany's entire industrial might had been focused on war production for years. Civilian goods had become increasingly scarce. Luxuries had disappeared. Even basic necessities were rationed carefully. Yet America, while fighting a war on two fronts, still had the industrial capacity to manufacture toys as throwaway prizes in candy boxes. Margaret found her voice, though speaking, the words felt like betrayal. "My brothers used to talk about the shortages before I was captured," she said slowly. "Rubber, metal, fuel. Everything was desperately needed for the war effort. We were told that America was suffering even worse shortages, that their economy was collapsing under the strain of war production." She held up the tiny compass. "But they're putting metal compasses in candy boxes, not to boost morale or support the war effort, just because that's what they do normally, even during wartime." The silence that followed her observation was heavy with implications none of them wanted to fully acknowledge. If America had such abundance that they could waste resources on toys and candy boxes during wartime, what did that say about German propaganda, claims of American weakness? What did it say about the inevitable German victory they had all been promised? Lisa spoke from her corner bunk, her medical training lending weight to her analytical approach. "I've been working in their infirmary for 3 weeks," she said. "They have medicines I've never seen before. Antibiotics, painkillers, supplies that never run short. And they use them on us, on enemy prisoners, without hesitation. That's not the action of a country struggling with scarcity." Young Clara, who usually stayed quiet during these discussions, surprised everyone by speaking up. "My father worked in a factory making ball bearings," she said softly. "Before I left for service, he told me that Germany would win because we were more efficient, more disciplined, more focused than the Americans. He said American industrial capacity was a myth, that their factories were primitive and their workers lazy." She looked down at the small, stuffed animal she had received in a trade, one of the Crackerjack prizes another woman had found. "But if they can put toys in candy boxes during a war, while we struggle to produce enough bullets, what does that say about everything my father believed?" Johanna Schmidt had been sitting apart from the main group listening, but not participating. Now she stood, her expression hard. "You're all being fooled," she said, her voice carrying across the barracks. "This is exactly what the Americans want. They show you abundance, they treat you kindly, they make you doubt everything you know. And then when your guard is down, they will strike." She pulled out the tiny toy she had received, a small metal top. "This means nothing. It's a trick, a manipulation. Don't let them turn you against your own country with cheap bribes." But even as she spoke, Margaret saw the uncertainty in Johanna's eyes. Saw the way her fingers clutched the toy, unwilling to throw it away despite her words. Johanna wanted to believe what she was saying, needed to believe it, because if the Americans weren't lying, if this abundance was real, then what had her husband died for? What were her sons still fighting for? Margaret lay awake again that night, the tiny compass resting on the small table beside her bed. She had tried to write a letter home earlier, one of the censored letters Captain Mitchell allowed them to compose, but the words had felt hollow. Dear Mama and Papa, I am well and being treated in accordance with international law. The Americans provide adequate food and shelter. Please do not worry about my circumstances. True but empty, revealing nothing of the transformation happening inside her. On a separate piece of paper, one she would never submit for censorship, she had begun writing what she really wanted to say. Dear Mama, I don't know how to tell you this. I don't know if I should, but everything we believed about America was wrong. Not slightly wrong or exaggerated, completely fundamentally wrong. They have abundance beyond anything I can adequately describe. Yesterday, an American soldier complained that his coffee wasn't hot enough. Complained about coffee temperature as if having unlimited coffee is a right rather than a luxury. I've seen them throw away food that would feed a German family for days. Not rotten food. Perfectly good food that they simply didn't want to finish. Their prisoners eat better than our civilians. I don't know what this means for Germany, for the war, for everything I believed I was fighting for. She had stopped writing, her hand trembling. Even in an unsendable letter, the words felt dangerous. December 23, 1944, brought an unexpected development that would further challenge the German prisoners' understanding of their situation. Captain Mitchell announced that the International Red Cross had delivered Christmas packages for distribution to all prisoners of war, including the German women at Camp Ellis. The packages arrived in the mess hall during afternoon assembly, stacked in neat rows on tables near the serving line. Each box bore Red Cross markings and contained items donated by American civilians specifically for enemy prisoners. The concept itself was difficult for Margaret to process. American citizens, while their own sons and brothers fought German soldiers overseas, had voluntarily contributed goods to provide comfort to captured German personnel. The contradiction with propaganda, claims about American hatred and barbarism, was impossible to ignore. When Captain Mitchell called the women forward to receive their packages, Margaret approached with the same cautious suspicion she had maintained since arrival. But as she opened the cardboard box with her name written on it in careful English script, that suspicion crumbled further. Inside, she found a knitted scarf in soft blue wool, clearly handmade, each stitch evidence of hours of careful labor. A bar of soap that smelled of lavender, a luxury after months of harsh military soap. A small bag of hard candies wrapped individually in colorful paper. A deck of playing cards, red bicycle brand, pristine and new. A paperback book in German, a Thomas Mann novel that had been banned in Germany since 1933. And a handwritten note card. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she read it. To a German prisoner, may you find peace this Christmas season. From the Riverside Lutheran Church Ladies Auxiliary, Davenport, Iowa. She stared at the card, reading it multiple times. These American women had spent time and resources to provide comfort to enemy prisoners. They had knitted scarves and selected books and written personal notes to people they would never meet, people whose country was trying to kill their loved ones. Around her, other women were opening similar packages, finding similar treasures, reading similar notes. Clara began crying quietly, clutching a small stuffed bear that someone had tucked into her package. The toy was worn clearly well-loved before being donated. Someone had given up something precious to comfort an enemy child. Kate held a pair of knitted mittens, her analytical mind clearly struggling to fit this evidence into any framework that made sense. Anna read her note card aloud, her voice thick with emotion. Dear German friend, we pray for your safe return home when this terrible war ends. We pray for peace between our nations. We pray that you know God's love, even in captivity. The Henderson family, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. That evening, the German women sat in their barracks surrounded by the contents of their Red Cross packages, trying to reconcile this generosity with everything they had been taught about American character. These were not strategic gifts from military leadership. These were personal gestures from ordinary American civilians who had chosen compassion over hatred. They pity us, one woman said, her voice defensive. They're trying to prove their moral superiority. But even as she spoke, her hands clutched the knitted scarf she had received, her fingers tracing the careful stitches that someone had labored over for hours. Margaret held the Thomas Mann novel, a book she had never been allowed to read in Germany. The symbolism was not lost on her. In America, even enemy prisoners had access to literature that the Reich had banned for its own citizens. What did that say about which system truly valued knowledge and freedom of thought? Christmas Day in Camp Ellis was unlike anything the German prisoners had imagined. Captain Mitchell had arranged for a small, decorated tree in each barracks. The trees were real fresh cut pine, their scent filling the wooden buildings with memories of home and childhood. Such frivolous use of resources during wartime was more evidence of American abundance. The mess hall served a special meal that included roasted turkey, the skin crackling golden brown as it was carved at the serving line, stuffing rich with sage and onion, the steam rising in fragrant clouds, cranberry sauce deep red and glistening like rubies under the lights, mashed potatoes whipped into soft clouds with butter melting into golden pools, green bean casserole topped with crispy fried onions, fresh rolls yeasty and warm soft inside with golden crusts, pumpkin pie spiced with cinnamon and ginger topped with clouds of real whipped cream, coffee milk apple cider. The sensory overload was almost unbearable. The sounds of turkey skin crackling silverware, clinking quiet Christmas carols from a radio in the corner. The smells of roasted meat, sage, cinnamon pine from the trees, coffee. The colors, golden turkey, red cranberries, white potatoes, green beans, brown pie. Margaret took her first bite of pumpkin pie, the sweet spice and smooth filling and buttery crust combining in her mouth. She felt tears forming and blinked them back. This abundance while Germany starved. This generosity while her people suffered. The guilt was overwhelming. The American guards who worked the holiday shift seemed cheerful rather than resentful. Several had brought small gifts for the prisoners they supervised regularly. Sergeant Hayes arrived at the administration building with a box of chocolates to share with his workers. He had chosen to work Christmas Day, had brought gifts voluntarily. When he offered the box to Margaret, she saw kindness in his eyes. Not pity, not superiority, just simple human kindness. Private Miller brought fresh cookies his mother had mailed from Iowa to distribute in the laundry facility. Oatmeal raisins still slightly warm, wrapped in wax paper with a note from his mother that read, "Share with your new friends." His mother had called German prisoners of war friends. The word choice felt significant. Lieutenant Chen gave each of her medical staff, including Lisa, a small pin bearing the caduceus symbol. "Professional respect transcends nationality," she said in careful English, her accent carrying traces of her San Francisco childhood. Lisa pinned it to her uniform, tears streaming down her face. These gestures were creating relationships that transcended the prisoner-guard dynamic. The German women found themselves having actual conversations with their American captors, struggling through language barriers to share stories about their families, their homes, their hopes for when the war finally ended. Margaret discovered that Sergeant Hayes had two daughters roughly her age. He showed her photographs from his wallet, his pride evident, despite the language difficulties. She found herself telling him about her brothers, about Dresden before the war, about her work in France. The conversation was halting and incomplete, but it was genuine. For the first time since her capture, she was talking to an American not as an enemy, but as a person. In the medical facility, Lisa and Lieutenant Chen had developed an efficient working relationship that relied on shared professional knowledge rather than common language. Chen had begun teaching Lisa English medical terminology, while Lisa taught Chen some German. Their conversations often drifted beyond medicine to personal topics. Chen spoke about growing up in San Francisco as the daughter of Chinese immigrants, about facing prejudice while also finding opportunity, about working her way through medical school despite discrimination, about believing in American ideals even when America fell short of them. Her story complicated Margaret's understanding of American society in ways that propaganda had never addressed. The Reich's narrative had portrayed America as monolithically barbaric, but Chen's experience showed nuanced complexity, contradiction. America had both discrimination and opportunity, both prejudice and possibility. Young Clara had become something of a mascot in the laundry facility. Her youth and obvious homesickness touched the American soldiers who worked there. Private Miller had taken a protective interest in her welfare, making sure she understood her tasks and wasn't overwhelmed by the work. He taught her English phrases, laughed at her mistakes without mockery, and shared stories about his younger sister back in Iowa, who was about Clara's age. These connections were dangerous to the identity the German women had constructed around being loyal servants of the Reich. It was easier to maintain ideological purity when the enemy remained faceless and abstract. But Sergeant Hayes was not an abstract enemy. He was a middle-aged father from Ohio who showed pictures of his daughters and shared his coffee. Lieutenant Chen was not a faceless American oppressor. She was a second-generation immigrant who had worked her way through medical school despite discrimination. Private Miller was not a ruthless soldier. He was a homesick farm boy who missed his family and treated everyone with instinctive Midwestern kindness. Anna articulated what many of them were feeling during an evening conversation in the barracks. "We can't hate people we know," she said quietly. "That's why propaganda always dehumanizes the enemy. Once you see them as individuals with families and dreams and kindness, once you see their humanity, you can't maintain the hatred necessary for war." Johanna's response was significant in its absence. She didn't argue. She sat holding the Bible from her Christmas package, her expression troubled. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she admitted quietly. It was the first open acknowledgement of doubt Margaret had heard from her. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Johanna's hand in solidarity. They were all lost together. January 15th, 1945, brought the first letters from Germany. They had been carefully screened by both German and American censors before being delivered to the prisoners at Camp Ellis. Not every woman received mail, and many of the letters that did arrive carried devastating news. Margaret's letter came from a neighbor in Dresden, not from her parents. Her hands shook as she opened it, immediately understanding what that meant. The neighbor wrote in careful, formal German. Margaret's parents had been killed in the Allied bombing raid of October 7th, 1944. Her mother had died instantly when their apartment building collapsed. Her father had survived 3 days in a makeshift hospital before succumbing to his injuries. The neighbor had no news of her brothers. Margaret sat on her bunk holding the letter in numb hands, reading the words over and over without fully processing them. Her parents were dead. The family she had been writing unsendable letters to no longer existed. The home she had dreamed of returning to was rubble. Around her, similar scenes were playing out. Of the 43 German women at Camp Ellis, 28 had received letters. 17 of those letters contained news of deaths: parents, siblings, children, husbands. The toll of Allied bombing and Soviet advance was documented in careful censored language that couldn't hide the devastation. Kate learned that her entire neighborhood in Berlin had been destroyed. Lisa discovered that her fiancé had been killed on the Eastern Front 6 months earlier. Anna's sister and her children had been killed in Hamburg firebombing. Clara's letter brought the most heartbreaking news of all. Her father, who had worked in the ball bearing factory, had been killed in an industrial accident when the factory was bombed. Her mother and younger sister had been evacuated to the countryside, but to an unknown location. The letter from a former neighbor contained no information about how Clara might contact them. The girl was utterly alone, with no idea if her family was even alive or where to find them. The grief that filled the barracks that night was profound and complicated. These women were mourning losses caused by the very forces that now held them captive. Yet those same captors had shown them more kindness and humanity than their own government ever had. The Americans who had destroyed their homes were also the Americans who shared coffee and Christmas packages and treated them with dignity. How could they reconcile mourning with gratitude? How could they hate and appreciate simultaneously? Captain Mitchell arrived the next morning, her face showing genuine compassion. She had been informed of the letter's contents through the censorship process and had come to offer what comfort she could. Through a translator, she expressed condolences for each woman's losses. She offered access to the camp chaplain for anyone who wished to speak with him. She provided writing materials for condolence letters. She gave them the day off from work assignments to grieve. The gesture was simple but meaningful. She didn't have to acknowledge their grief. She could have maintained professional distance and let them process their losses privately. But she chose to show up to recognize their pain, to offer support. That afternoon, Margaret found herself in the camp chapel, a small building she had never entered before. Father Thomas O'Brien, the Catholic chaplain, spoke limited German, but offered his presence more than his words. She sat in a pew and cried for the first time since her capture, mourning not just her parents, but everything she had lost: her country, her beliefs, her understanding of the world, her sense of who she was. Father O'Brien sat beside her in silence, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. When she finally stopped crying, he spoke in halting German. Grief is grief, regardless of uniforms or nationalities. Your pain is real and valid. God weeps with you for all victims of this terrible war. Germans, Americans, Jews, homage his children. He didn't excuse, didn't judge, just acknowledged Charles' shared humanity. Margaret noticed movement in the back of the chapel. Johanna sat in the last row weeping silently, the green scarf from her Christmas package wrapped around her shoulders. She clutched the letter in her hands. Margaret walked back and sat beside her. No words were necessary. Johanna leaned against Margaret's shoulder and sobbed. Margaret held her and cried too, the walls between them finally completely down. Johanna's letter had confirmed both her sons dead killed on the Eastern Front within weeks of each other. She had lost everything. Husband, sons, the future she had imagined. And for what? For a cause that was crumbling, for a Reich that had lied to her about everything. That evening in the barracks, the women gathered around the table supporting each other. They shared memories of lost loved ones. German and English mixed in conversation. For the first time, they acknowledged the complexity. They could mourn German dead. They could appreciate American kindness. They could hold both truths simultaneously. They could be more than just Germans or just prisoners. They could be human beings navigating impossible circumstances with whatever grace they could find. February 16, 1945. Captain Mitchell gathered all the German women in the mess hall, her face grave. She explained through a translator what they were about to see. Allied forces pushing deeper into German territory had begun discovering and liberating concentration camps. The first photographs and reports were appearing in American newspapers. These were not propaganda images, she emphasized. These were documentary photographs taken by American and British military photographers as evidence of what they had discovered. War crimes documentation for future tribunals. The photographs were spread across the tables. Margaret approached slowly, her heart already knowing what her mind refused to accept. The first photograph showed Gates, Bergen-Belsen, the infamous slogan in metal letters. The second showed emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood limbs at impossible angles, faces frozen in final agony. The third showed survivors who looked more like skeletons than human beings, their eyes hollow and haunted. Then gas chambers, crematoria, personal belongings sorted into massive piles, shoes, glasses, human hair. Margaret stared at the photographs, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be Germany. This couldn't be what she had been serving. But the evidence was undeniable. The photographs were too detailed, too numerous, too consistent to be fabrications. These places existed. These atrocities had occurred. These horrors had been perpetrated by the government she had sworn to serve. Around her, other women reacted with similar shock and denial. Some turned away, unable to look. Others leaned closer as if proximity might reveal the images to be false. Clara vomited into a waste bin, her young face pale with horror. Anna sat down heavily, her teacher's rationality crumbling in the face of evidence that contradicted everything she had believed about German civilization and culture. This is enemy propaganda, one woman insisted desperately. They fabricated these images to justify their invasion of our homeland. But Captain Mitchell had anticipated this reaction. She produced newspapers from neutral countries, Swiss and Swedish publications that confirmed the Allied reports. She provided testimony from international Red Cross observers who had visited the liberated camps. She offered to arrange for the women to speak with American soldiers who had participated in the liberations and could provide first-hand accounts. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. These camps existed. These crimes had been committed. These victims had suffered and died while ordinary Germans like themselves had claimed ignorance. Margaret felt something break inside her, some fundamental piece of her identity that could never be repaired. She had served the Reich believing she was defending her homeland, but her homeland had built factories of death. Her country had systematized murder. Her government had perpetrated evil on a scale that defied comprehension. "What have we done?" Kate whispered, speaking the question that haunted all of them. What were we part of? That night, no one in Barrack 7 slept. The women sat in small groups, speaking in hushed German, trying to process the impossible reality they now faced. The days following the revelation of the concentration camps were the darkest period of the German women's captivity. The physical conditions hadn't changed. The Americans continued to treat them with the same professional courtesy and unexpected kindness. But internally, each woman was grappling with questions of complicity, guilt, and identity that had no easy answers. Margaret stopped eating properly. She would sit in the mess hall with food in front of her and think about the starving prisoners in those photographs. How could she accept abundance while knowing what her countrymen had done? Anna threw herself into research, requesting access to every newspaper and document about the camps that the Americans would provide. She needed to understand the scope of it, the systems that had enabled it, the signs that ordinary Germans should have seen. She was a teacher trained to analyze and educate. She needed to comprehend how an entire nation could commit such evil while believing they served righteousness. Kate's guilt manifested differently. She had worked in communications, transmitting orders and information throughout the military network. Had her work facilitated these crimes? Had messages she transmitted sent people to these death camps? She couldn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. Lisa found herself questioning every patient she had treated, every soldier she had helped recover. Had she helped men who participated in atrocities? Had she returned them to duty so they could commit more crimes? Her medical oath required her to treat all patients regardless of circumstance, but that principle felt hollow now. Young Clara was perhaps the most devastated. At 19, she had believed she was serving her country with honor. Now she discovered that her country had no honor. The father she had lost in the factory bombing had spent his last years producing materials for a government that built murder factories. The American staff at Camp Ellis watched the German prisoners' anguish with mixed emotions. Some felt the women deserved to suffer with this knowledge that guilt was appropriate given what their country had done. But others, including Captain Mitchell and Sergeant Hayes, recognized the difference between individual culpability and collective guilt. These women had served the Reich, yes, but they had not personally committed atrocities. Most had been unaware of the camp's existence. They were guilty of ignorance, of believing propaganda, of serving an evil system. But they were not guilty of the specific crimes that had been revealed. Father O'Brien began holding daily counseling sessions for any prisoner who wanted to speak with him. The chapel became a refuge where women could voice their guilt, their shame, their confusion about how to reconcile their past service with their current knowledge. God can forgive anything, the chaplain told them through a translator. But you must first forgive yourselves for not knowing what you could not have known. Then you must commit to being better than you were, to standing against such evil if you ever encounter it again. It was Lieutenant Chen who offered perhaps the most meaningful perspective during a conversation with Lisa in the medical facility. America isn't perfect, Chen said, her English slow and careful, so Lisa could understand. We have our own shameful history. Japanese American citizens are imprisoned in camps right now because of their ancestry. We committed genocide against native peoples. We enslaved Africans for centuries. But we also have capacity for change, for acknowledging wrong, for striving toward better. She paused, choosing her words with care. You can't undo what was done, but you can choose who you become from this point forward. That choice defines you more than your past. Lisa looked at her with desperate hope. I want to be better. I want to do better. Chen smiled gently. Then you will be. That desire is the first step. In the barracks, the discussions began shifting from despair toward tentative hope. Anna spoke with the authority of her teaching background. We have to carry this knowledge, have to ensure the next generation of Germans knows the truth, have to prevent this from ever happening again. That's how we make meaning from horror. Kate added her practical analysis. We can be voices for truth when we return, can refuse to accept propaganda blindly, can question authority instead of following without thought. Even Clara found words of hope. Maybe I can find my mother and sister. Maybe I can help rebuild Germany into something better, something that would never allow such evil again. Johanna's transformation was perhaps the most profound. On February 28th, she finally opened the Bible from her Christmas package. She read Matthew 25, verse 40. Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. She realized that the Americans at Camp Ellis had been showing her what those words actually meant. While she had served a system that murdered the least of these supposed enemies had demonstrated Christ's love through their actions. She approached Margaret with tears streaming down her face. "I was wrong," she said simply. "About Americans, about the war, about everything. I don't know how to move forward." Margaret took her hands. "None of us do, but maybe we figure it out together." May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Captain Mitchell gathered all the German prisoners in the mess hall that afternoon to make an official announcement. The war's end meant that repatriation procedures would begin. Within weeks, arrangements would be made to transport the German women back to their homeland. They would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to rebuild their lives in post-war Germany. The words that should have brought joy and relief instead created a heavy silence in the room. 6 months ago, these women would have celebrated the prospect of going home. But everything had changed. The Germany they were returned to was not the country they had left. Margaret sat at one of the long tables processing what repatriation meant. She had no family to return to. Her parents were dead. Her brother's fates unknown. Dresden was in ruins, occupied by Soviet forces. What exactly was she returning to? A destroyed city in a defeated nation where she would be seen as part of the system that had committed unspeakable crimes. Around her, the other women were making similar calculations. Kate's Berlin was devastated. Anna's Hamburg had been firebombed. Clara didn't even know where her mother and sister were located. She could spend months searching for them in the chaos, and what if she never found them? Johanna had lost both sons and her husband. Munich was damaged, her home destroyed. She would be returning to nothing but grief and rubble. But beyond the physical destruction was something deeper. These women had changed. They had seen American abundance and kindness. They had confronted the truth about the Reich they served. They had developed relationships with Americans that challenged everything they had been taught about enemies and hatred. They had discovered that the supposed inferior democracy had treated them with more dignity than their own superior system ever had. That evening in Barrack 7, the conversations were subdued and introspective. Some women expressed relief at the prospect of going home despite the difficulties they would face. Germany was still Germany, still their homeland, regardless of its condition. Others voiced fears about what awaited them. Would they be punished for their service to the Reich? Would they face retribution from occupation forces? Would they be able to find work and housing in the case of post-war Germany? But a small group led by Margaret began discussing something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. What if they didn't return to Germany immediately? What if they found a way to remain in America at least temporarily? The idea was radical and complicated. They were still technically prisoners of war. They had no legal status to remain in the United States. But the thought of returning to nothing, of facing a destroyed homeland and an uncertain future, felt overwhelming. Here at Camp Ellis, they had found something unexpected. Not just physical safety and abundance, but a sense of possibility. They had been treated as individuals capable of change rather than as irredeemable enemies. They had been shown what redemption might look like. Over the following week, the discussions in Barrack 7 grew more intense and more desperate. Anna articulated what many were feeling. "We return to what?" she asked quietly. "To cities that no longer exist. To a country that will spend decades living down the shame of what was done in its name. To a society that will either deny the camps existed or blame everyone who served in any capacity." Kate added her practical analysis. "The occupation zones are chaotic. Food is scarce. Infrastructure is destroyed. We have no idea what legal status we'll have, what rights will possess, whether we'll even be safe." Lisa spoke from her medical perspective. "I've been reading about the conditions in Germany through the newspapers Captain Mitchell allows us to see. Disease is rampant. Malnutrition is widespread. The medical system has collapsed. I could help people there, yes, but I could also help here with access to proper supplies and training. Perhaps do more good." Clara's contribution was simpler and more emotional. "I don't know where my mother and sister are," she said, her voice breaking. "I could spend months searching for them in the chaos. What if I can't find them? What if they're in the Soviet zone and I can't reach them? I'd be alone in a destroyed country with nothing and no one threat." But not everyone agreed with this line of thinking. Several women remained adamant that returning to Germany was their duty. "Our country needs us now more than ever," one insisted. We can't abandon Germany in its darkest hour just because America is more comfortable. The debate revealed fundamental differences in how the women had processed their 6 months in American captivity. Some had maintained a wall between themselves and their captors. They had accepted American kindness, but hadn't allowed it to fundamentally change their identity as Germans serving Germany. Others, like Margaret, had undergone a more profound transformation. The kindness they had experienced, combined with the revelation of the concentration camps, had shattered their previous worldview. They no longer knew who they were or what they believed. The only certainty was that returning to Germany felt like stepping back into a nightmare they had briefly escaped. On May 15th, Captain Mitchell called Margaret to her office for a private conversation. Through a translator, the captain asked a direct question. If it were possible, would you choose to remain in the United States rather than return to Germany? Margaret hesitated, knowing her answer would define the rest of her life. Was this betrayal of her homeland, or was it choosing hope over despair? Finally, she answered, yes, I would choose to stay. Captain Mitchell's question had not been idle curiosity. She had been observing the German prisoners for 6 months, noting their transformation, their anguish over the camp, revelations, their obvious anxiety about repatriation. She had consulted with her superiors about the unprecedented situation developing at Camp Ellis. Some of these women genuinely had nothing to return to and had demonstrated sincere remorse for their country's actions. Perhaps there was another way forward. On May 20th, Mitchell called a general assembly for all German prisoners. She stood before them with documents from the War Department, her expression serious but not unkind. Speaking through the translator, she explained that repatriation remained the default expectation. Transportation would be arranged within 3 weeks. But then she said something no German prisoner in any American camp had heard before. However, given the unusual circumstances and the ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, the War Department has authorized a limited exception. Those who wish to remain in the United States temporarily may petition for reclassification as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war. This status would allow you to seek sponsorship, employment, and eventual immigration status. The words hung in the air like an impossible dream. Margaret felt her heart racing. This was real. This was actually being offered. Mitchell continued with the practical details. Displaced person status meant they would no longer be housed or supported by the military. They would need to find American families or organizations willing to sponsor them, provide housing, and vouch for their character. They would need to find employment. They would need to navigate immigration procedures that were complex and uncertain. It was a risk with no guarantees. The assembly dissolved into urgent German conversations. Some women immediately declared their intention to return to Germany. Others wanted time to consider, but 9 women led by Margaret knew their answer immediately. That evening, Margaret drafted a formal letter in careful English with Kate's help. It was addressed to Captain Mitchell and signed by 9 women. Captain Mitchell, we respectfully request reclassification as displaced persons and permission to remain in the United States. We have nothing to return to in Germany. Our families are dead or missing. Our homes are destroyed. Our cities are ruins. But more than physical destruction, we return to a nation that perpetrated evil we cannot reconcile with our understanding of German culture and values. We have discovered in American captivity principles of dignity, opportunity, and redemption that we wish to embrace fully. We have been shown mercy when we expected cruelty. We have been treated as human beings capable of change when we expected to be treated as irredeemable enemies. We wish to demonstrate through our actions and our lives that transformation is possible, that former enemies can become friends, that individuals can choose to be better than the systems that form them. We understand the difficulties we face. We accept the uncertainty. We know we have no right to this extraordinary opportunity, but we believe that choosing to stay and build new lives here is choosing hope over despair, future over past, redemption over guilt. We humbly ask for the chance to prove ourselves worthy of this grace you have shown us. All 9 women signed their names. The letter represented an unprecedented request in the history of American prisoner of war operations. German prisoners begging to remain with their captors rather than accept freedom to return home. Mitchell read the letter twice, understanding its historical significance. Then she picked up her phone to begin making calls. The decision by 9 German prisoners to request displaced person status leaked to local newspapers within days. The story spread quickly, generating reactions that ranged from supportive to hostile across Illinois and beyond. The Peoria Journal ran an editorial titled, "Enemy Prisoners Seek American Dream." The Chicago Tribune published a more skeptical piece, questioning whether Nazi personnel should receive special consideration while American soldiers still fought in the Pacific. Local radio stations debated the issue, with callers expressing passionate opinions on both sides. Some Americans argued that showing mercy to former enemies demonstrated American values at their finest. Others insisted that these women should face the consequences of their country's actions by returning to rebuild Germany. Religious organizations were among the first to step forward with support. Father O'Brien contacted the Catholic Diocese of Peoria, which began organizing potential sponsors. The Riverside Lutheran Church in Davenport, the same congregation that had sent Christmas packages, offered to sponsor 2 of the women. The Henderson family from Cedar Rapids, who had included the note about praying for peace in their Christmas package, contacted Captain Mitchell directly. Mrs. Sarah Henderson, a school teacher who had organized the Christmas delegation, saw in Margaret's request something profoundly American: the belief that people could transform themselves, that past mistakes didn't have to define future possibilities, that redemption was available to those willing to work for it. But opposition was also organized and vocal. A veterans group in Chicago sent a telegram to the War Department protesting any special treatment for German prisoners. They argued that while American families grieved sons killed by German forces, the government was considering allowing German military personnel to remain in the country. The debate reached Washington. Congressmen received letters from constituents on both sides. The story became a symbol of larger questions about justice, forgiveness, and American identity in the post-war world. What did it mean to be American? Was it about birthplace and blood, or about embracing certain values and principles? Could former enemies become Americans if they genuinely transformed? At Camp Ellis, the 9 women who had requested to stay waited anxiously while their fate was decided in offices and committees far from their control. They continued their work assignments, maintained their routines, but every day brought the repatriation date closer. The other German prisoners who had chosen to return to Germany prepared for departure with mixed emotions. Some were relieved to be going home despite the difficulties awaiting them. Others seemed almost envious of those who had found the courage to choose a different path. One woman confronted Margaret a final time before the groups would separate forever. "You're abandoning our country when it needs us most," she said bitterly. "History will remember you as traitors who chose comfort over duty." Margaret met her eyes steadily. "We're not abandoning Germany. We're choosing to honor what Germany should have been by embracing what we've learned here. Some of you will rebuild our homeland with your hands and your courage. We'll carry the lessons of reconciliation and redemption to build bridges between our nations. Perhaps both paths serve Germany in different ways." The woman's expression softened slightly. "I still believe you should return with us, but I understand why you're staying. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps both paths have value." June 15, 1945 arrived with bittersweet finality. The day when the German prisoners at Camp Ellis would separate, some returning to their defeated homeland, others embarking on an uncertain American future. Captain Mitchell had received final approval from Washington 3 days earlier. The 9 women who requested displaced person status would be released into the sponsorship of various American families and organizations. The remaining 34 would board transport ships to Europe within the week. The morning assembly in the mess hall felt more like a family gathering than a military procedure. 6 months of shared experience had created bonds that transcended nationality and war. These women had supported each other through grief revelation and transformation. Now they were choosing different paths forward, but the connection would remain. Margaret stood to address the group, her English now fluent enough to speak without a translator. "We are not abandoning Germany," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "We are choosing to honor what Germany should have been by embracing what we have learned here. Some of you will rebuild our homeland with your hands and your courage. We will carry the lessons of reconciliation and redemption to build bridges between our nations. Perhaps both paths serve Germany in different ways." The woman who had earlier criticized their choice stepped forward. "I still believe you should return with us, but I understand why you're staying. Perhaps both paths serve Germany in different ways. You can be ambassadors here while we work to create a country worthy of the name again. The women who were returning boarded trucks that afternoon, carrying letters from their American friends, photographs from their time at Camp Ellis, and small gifts that represented the unexpected connections they had formed. They carried something more important as well, the knowledge that former enemies could show mercy, that redemption was possible, that humanity could transcend nationalism. The 9 who remained stood watching the trucks depart, feeling the weight of their choice settle on their shoulders. They were no longer prisoners. They were no longer German military personnel. They were displaced persons seeking new identities in a foreign land. The Henderson family arrived that evening to collect Margaret. Mrs. Sarah Henderson embraced her like a daughter, speaking slowly in English about the room they had prepared the job interview they had arranged at the local library, the English classes at the community center. Kate was sponsored by a Lutheran congregation in Davenport. Anna found placement with a university professor's family in Iowa City who needed help with their children while valuing her teaching credentials. Lisa was accepted into a nursing program at a Chicago hospital with sponsorship from the Catholic diocese. Young Clara was taken in by the Miller family. Private Miller's parents insisted that the girl who had worked so hard in the laundry deserved a real family to support her voyage. As Margaret left Camp Ellis for the last time, she carried only a small bag of possessions. But she also carried the Cracker Jack compass that had started her transformation, a symbol of how something small and ordinary could reveal profound truths. 23 years later, November 1968, Margaret Weber Henderson stood in the university lecture hall, the tiny compass on the podium before her, and looked out at the audience. Her daughter Sarah sat in the third row, 22 years old and studying international relations. Her son Michael, 18, sat beside his sister. Both children had never known war, had grown up in a peaceful America, had been raised with knowledge of both their German heritage and their American future. Margaret concluded her lecture with words she had spent 2 decades learning to say. This compass showed me a new direction when I was lost. America gave me the freedom to follow that direction, to discover who I could become rather than being trapped by who I had been. That is the true power of this country, not its military might or economic strength, but its capacity to offer second chances to those willing to earn them. She paused, holding up the tiny compass so the afternoon light caught its surface. The American sergeant who gave me this Cracker Jack box had no idea he was changing a life. He was just sharing candy during a work break. That's what makes it so profound. He didn't see me as an enemy to be converted. He saw me as a person to share with. That simple act of seeing my humanity when I'd been taught to deny his, that's what transformed me. And that transformation has defined every day of the past 23 years. In the back row, unnoticed until now, sat an elderly woman with a green scarf around her shoulders despite the indoor heating. Johanna Schmidt had driven 3 hours from Chicago to support Margaret. After the lecture, she made her way to the front of the hall. The 2 women embraced former enemies who had become sisters through shared suffering and shared grace. "You spoke our truth beautifully," Johanna said. That evening, Margaret and Johanna stood outside the lecture hall looking up at the stars. The November air was cold, reminiscent of that first day at Camp Ellis so many years ago. "Do you ever regret staying?" Johanna asked. "Not once," Margaret replied. "Do you?" "Oh, not once. We made the right choice." Margaret pulled out the Cracker Jack compass, holding it in her palm. "Remember when we first saw these, when nothing made sense?" Johanna laughed. "I thought it was an American propaganda trick. Turns out it was just America. Just ordinary abundance, ordinary kindness. That was the trick. There was no trick." Sarah approached with several students who had questions about the lecture. Margaret smiled at Johanna. "Come, help me answer them." The 2 former enemies, now lifelong friends, returned to the lecture hall to teach the next generation about redemption, transformation, and second chances, about the power of seeing humanity in those we're taught to hate. The tiny compass sat on the podium, still pointing north, still showing the way. Sometimes the smallest things change everything. Sometimes mercy is stronger than hatred. Sometimes former enemies become family. Sometimes a compass made for a child's amusement can point the way to redemption. Between 1945 and 1948, over 400,000 German prisoners of war were held in camps across the United States. While the story of Margaret and her 8 companions is unique, it represents a broader truth, that small acts of kindness can transform enemies into friends, that the American experiment in redemption continues with each generation willing to see the humanity in those they're taught to fear. The other 8 women who had chosen to stay found their own paths to contribution and belonging. Catherine Fisher became a translator for the State Department, helping facilitate German-American diplomatic relations. She married, raised 3 children, and lived in Washington until her death in 1985. Anna Richter earned her doctorate and taught German literature at the University of Chicago. She published several books on post-war German culture and remained devoted to scholarship until her retirement in 1979. Elizabeth Hoffman served as head nurse at Cook County Hospital in Chicago, training generations of nurses. She married a doctor, was widowed in 1965, and adopted 2 children who carried on her legacy of service. Clara Becker married an American soldier in 1948 and raised 4 children in Iowa. She worked as a teacher's aide in the public schools and finally located her mother and sister in 1952, helping them immigrate to America in 1955. The reunion after 7 years apart was captured in local newspapers, a testament to perseverance and hope. Johanna Schmidt took the longest to adjust. She worked various jobs before finding her calling as a counselor for other displaced persons, helping new immigrants navigate the American system. She never remarried but devoted herself to service, finding purpose in helping others find their own second chances. The other 4 women pursued various paths, teaching, nursing, business, families. All contributed to American society. All remained grateful for their second chance. All carried knowledge of where they came from and what they learned. Their collective legacy influenced American immigration policy and changed attitudes toward former enemies. They proved that transformation was possible, that showing mercy could create stronger bonds than military victory alone. But perhaps their most important legacy was the example they set for how individuals can transcend the worst aspects of their history. They had served an evil system but were not defined by that service. They had been given the opportunity to become something better and had seized that opportunity with both hands. Margaret Weber Henderson lived until 1993, dying peacefully at the age of 72, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her daughter Sarah became a diplomat serving in the State Department's European Division and working on German-American relations. Her son Michael became a history teacher, ensuring that the lessons of the past were never forgotten. The Cracker Jack compass passed to Sarah, then to Sarah's daughter, becoming a family heirloom that represented more than just a child's toy. It represented the moment when propaganda met reality and reality won. When hatred met kindness and kindness prevailed. In the end, that's what mattered most. Not the grand gestures or dramatic moments, but the small acts of ordinary humanity extended across enemy lines. A sergeant sharing candy during a work break. A church congregation knitting scarves for strangers. A captain acknowledging the grief of prisoners. A chaplain offering comfort without judgment. These small mercies multiplied across 6 months had the power to transform lives and change history. The story of the Cracker Jack compass reminds us that redemption is always possible, that people are not defined solely by their worst moments or their greatest mistakes, that second chances, when offered with sincerity and accepted with humility, can create something beautiful from the ashes of war. And sometimes, just sometimes, a tiny toy in a box of candy can point the way home.